The aggressive, rhythmic pounding on my hotel room door at 6 in the morning wasn't just noise, it was an invasion. It rattled the frame, a stark punctuation to the silence I'd finally found after the most calculated, life-altering decision I'd ever made. I knew, without even looking, that it was Chloe's father. Richard. His fury was palpable, even through a solid oak door, and it was the immediate consequence of a single, quiet sentence I'd uttered less than 12 hours earlier, I understand. That sentence had ended my wedding. My name is Ethan, and I'm 32. I built my software company from absolutely nothing. No trust fund, no early investors, just me in a cramped, 400-square-foot apartment, living on instant noodles and coding until my eyes burned. It was a grind, a constant uphill battle, but it was mine. 3 years into that relentless journey, I met Chloe at a networking event. She was vibrant, captivating, and for 3 years, she was my world. We got engaged 8 months ago, the wedding planned for just 4 months away. I'm not an impulsive person. Every major decision in my life is meticulously researched, analyzed, and planned from every angle. It's how I run my business, and it's how I approach life. So, when Mr. Davison, my friend Sam's dad and a seasoned divorce lawyer, pulled me aside 6 months before the wedding, I listened. He'd seen every nightmare scenario imaginable, and he told me, point blank, that I needed a prenup. Not because Chloe was a bad person, he stressed, but because my company wasn't just a passion, it was a livelihood for my employees, it held millions in contracts, and it housed years of developed intellectual property. The prenup I had drafted was simple, genuinely fair. Everything I built before the marriage stayed mine. Everything we built together would be split 50-50. I truly believed it was the most reasonable document in the world. I first brought it up over dinner at our favorite Italian spot in Burlington, Vermont. I kept my tone light, casual, explaining it as smart planning for both our futures. She smiled, nodded, said she'd look it over. For 2 weeks, silence. No questions, no mention of it, no apparent concern. I felt a wave of relief, thinking we'd navigated a potential obstacle without any drama. Then the venue deadline hit. $15,000 for the final deposit, non-refundable, due in 72 hours. I knew we needed to finalize that prenup before I committed that kind of money. I brought it up again on a Tuesday night at my place. Chloe was on my couch, scrolling through wedding Pinterest boards, lost in visions of our future. The moment I said we should sign the prenup before I sent the venue payment, her entire energy shifted. It was like a switch flipped. Her smile vanished. Her shoulders went rigid. She closed her laptop with this slow, deliberate motion that somehow felt more menacing than a slam. I knew instantly that something had fundamentally changed. She looked at me, her voice cutting through the quiet. "This is an insult," she said, and it was a tone I genuinely never heard from her before, sharp, cold, foreign. She didn't stop there. Said I didn't trust her. Said her parents had been married 30 years without a prenup. Said if I really loved her, a legal document wouldn't be necessary. I stayed calm. Tried to explain, again, that it wasn't about trust. It was about protecting the business, the people who worked for me, about being responsible with something I'd built before we even met. But she wasn't listening to logic anymore. She looked me dead in the eye and delivered the ultimatum, "It's either me or that paper, Ethan. You choose." And something clicked. A lock tumbling into place in my brain. In that exact moment, I understood. She didn't see my company as something I'd created, she saw it as ours already. She saw herself entitled to half of everything I'd sacrificed for every 18-hour day, every missed vacation, every risk I'd taken. The romantic illusion, the one I'd carefully constructed, evaporated like steam. I looked at her, arms crossed, waiting for me to crumble, apologize, and choose love over logic. And this cold, clear certainty settled over me. I didn't argue. I didn't try to negotiate. I just said, very quietly, "I understand." I watched her face transform. She actually smiled, a little smirk of victory, and relaxed back into the couch. She thought she'd won. Thought she'd successfully pressured me into tearing up that paper, into proving my love on her terms. She went right back to her Pinterest boards, talking about flower arrangements like our conversation had never happened. I nodded at appropriate moments, made agreeable sounds as she showed me centerpiece options. The moment she left, around 10 p.m., I walked into my home office and started making calls. First, the venue. I canceled it. Lost the $5,000 deposit we'd already paid, but saved the remaining $10,000. Then, systematically, I went through my wedding vendor spreadsheet. Caterer, photographer, band, florist, cake designer, every single contract. Some vendors were confused, asked if we wanted to reschedule. I just said, no, the wedding isn't happening. Keep whatever deposits we've paid. By 2 a.m, my checklist was complete. I wrote a brief social media post, neutral and professional. Said Chloe and I had mutually decided to call off the wedding, thanked everyone for their support and understanding. Posted it. Turned off my phone. Packed a small bag. I checked into an extended stay hotel in downtown Hartford, Connecticut, one of those corporate places with a kitchenette and decent Wi-Fi. And I slept. Better than I had in months. No anxiety dreams about seating charts or cake flavors, just solid, dreamless sleep. When I powered my phone back on at 6 the next morning, I had 47 missed calls, 38 text messages, and my voicemail was maxed out. Most were from Chloe. The preview text showed her tone progressing from confused to angry to panicked over the course of the night. Some were from her mom, Deborah, increasingly frantic messages. A few from mutual friends, asking what the hell happened. I didn't respond to any of them. I just left my phone on the desk and went to make coffee. That's when the pounding started. Aggressive, heavy hits that made the door frame rattle. I peered through the peephole. A middle-aged man in an expensive, tailored suit, red-faced, jaw-clenched, radiating fury. I didn't recognize him from the angle, but I had a pretty good guess. So, instead of opening the door, I called the front desk. The woman who answered sounded genuinely nervous. Yes, sir. There's a man named Richard here in the lobby. He says he's your former fiancé's father and he's demanding to see you. Should I send security? No, I told her, I'll come down myself. I took my time getting dressed, finished my coffee, grabbed my laptop bag, and headed down. I knew this conversation would set the tone for everything that came next. Richard was waiting by the elevators, arms crossed, feet planted wide like he owned the building. The moment he saw me, he started walking, an aggressive, purposeful stride designed to make you back up. The front desk staff watched nervously. I noticed the security guard had positioned himself near the main entrance. I kept my face neutral as Richard got close enough for me to smell his expensive cologne. He didn't yell, which surprised me. Instead, he spoke in a low, controlled voice, somehow more threatening than shouting. Told me I had humiliated his daughter, embarrassed his entire family, made them look like fools in front of everyone they knew. He expected me to fix this situation immediately. I let him talk, didn't interrupt, just stood there with my hands in my pockets, my expression blank, waiting for him to run out of steam. When he finally paused, I said very calmly, "The relationship is over. There's nothing to discuss." His entire approach shifted. His face relaxed into a fake, friendly smile. His tone went from aggressive to reasonable. He started talking about how young people make mistakes under stress, how wedding planning brings out the worst in everyone. Said if I just came to dinner at their house, we could talk this through like adults, find a compromise. He said Chloe was heartbroken, that she'd overreacted about the prenup and regretted it. Said we could work something out that protected my business while still showing trust. The whole time he was talking, I was reading the subtext. This wasn't about reconciliation. This was about control. About getting me back into their orbit where they could manage the narrative and apply pressure until I signed away my protection. I told him no. The decision was final. I watched the mask slip completely. He leaned in close, so close I had to resist the urge to step back, and said, "You don't want to make an enemy out of me." His voice had gone ice cold. I understood right then that this wasn't a threat, it was a promise. A preview of exactly what was coming if I didn't fall in line. I didn't flinch. Didn't respond. I just held his stare for 3 long seconds, then turned and walked back to the elevator, leaving him standing there in the middle of the lobby. Over the next 2 weeks, Chloe launched what I can only describe as a reputation assassination campaign. I only heard about it through mutual friends because I'd blocked her number, her social media, every possible contact point. She was telling people I'd had some kind of breakdown, that I'd become paranoid, unstable, that the stress of the company had made me erratic. She positioned herself as the caring, devoted fiancée who'd tried everything to help her struggling partner, but had been pushed away. The scary thing was, some people believed it, because I wasn't defending myself or offering my side of the story. I made a conscious, deliberate choice to stay completely silent. No social media posts, no calls to friends to explain, no attempts to control the narrative. I just let her talk while I focused on practical legal steps. I had Mr. Davison draft a formal eviction notice, giving Chloe 30 days to remove her belongings from my apartment. It was legally airtight, professionally worded, sent via certified mail with all the proper documentation. When she received it, she apparently showed up at my office building, crying, demanding to see me. My assistant buzzed me to say Chloe was in the lobby, refusing to leave. I told her to contact building security. Didn't go down there. Didn't engage. Just had her escorted out. Chloe's mom, Deborah, started calling me from different phone numbers because I'd blocked her main line, leaving long, rambling voicemails about family and forgiveness, how I was breaking her baby's heart over a piece of paper. I'd listened to about 5 seconds, just enough to confirm it was her, then hit delete. I kept meticulous records of every single attempt at contact, with timestamps and call durations. Then the business attack started. Subtle at first, easy to miss if you weren't looking for patterns. My main supplier for server equipment suddenly wanted to reduce my credit line. Claimed it was routine policy review, nothing personal, but the timing made my instincts prickle. Then a client I'd worked with for 2 years called to cancel a major contract renewal. Vague corporate excuses about budget constraints, shifting priorities. But I heard through a mutual connection later that someone had reached out to their CFO with concerns about my company's stability and leadership. I started digging into Richard's background. Pulled up his business connections. I realized he sat on advisory boards with 3 of my clients, had investment ties to my equipment supplier, served on the same charity board as 2 potential partners. His fingers were in way more pies than I had originally understood. He was making quiet phone calls, planting seeds of doubt, leveraging his network to squeeze my business without leaving any obvious fingerprints. I had to admit, it was impressive, in a terrifyingly calculated way. Move-out day was scheduled for a Saturday, 3 weeks after the eviction notice. I deliberately stayed away from the apartment. Didn't want any possibility of a confrontation or a dramatic scene. So, I sent Sam and Mr. Davison over to supervise the whole process. I gave them a detailed inventory list of everything that was mine versus what Chloe had brought in. Told them to document the entire move with photos and video footage. I waited at a coffee shop for updates. Sam called me around 2 in the afternoon. Said everything was going smoothly. Chloe had hired professional movers, efficiently packing her belongings. No drama so far. I started to relax, thinking maybe this would end without incident. Then, about an hour later, Sam called back, his voice edged with disbelief. Chloe had tried to take my grandfather's watch. The one that sits in a display case in my bedroom, a 1960s Omega he'd worn every day of his adult life. She claimed I'd given it to her as an engagement gift last Christmas. A complete fabrication. That watch was one of the only things I had left from my grandfather, who died when I was 12. There was absolutely no universe where I would have given it away. Mr. Davison stepped in immediately, calm and professional. Explained that the watch had significant documented sentimental and monetary value, wasn't listed anywhere as a shared asset or gift. Politely suggested that if Chloe insisted it was a gift, she should be able to provide some evidence, photos from Christmas morning, a card, anything. She couldn't produce anything, obviously, so she backed down. But the fact that she'd even attempted it told me everything I needed to know about how she viewed our entire relationship. Sam said that as Chloe was walking out, she stopped at the threshold, turned back, and made a comment about how I was going to regret this. How her father had ways of dealing with people who crossed their family. How I had no idea what I just started. I told Sam to make absolutely sure that comment was documented in the formal report Mr. Davison was preparing, adding it to the growing file of concerning behavior. I sat in that coffee shop for a long time, just thinking. I wasn't scared, exactly, but I was exhausted. Bone-tired from the constant low-level stress of waiting for the next attack, wondering what Richard would do next. Which client he'd call, which supplier he'd pressure. Part of me genuinely considered just leaving, moving to another city where Richard's influence didn't reach, starting fresh somewhere his network couldn't touch me. But that felt like running. Like letting him win through intimidation. And I'd never been the type to run from anything in my life. I pulled up the security footage from my apartment building on my phone. Watched the clip of Chloe and the movers leaving. Saw her stop at the door, turn back toward the camera. And I made a decision, right there in that coffee shop. They thought I was weak because I'd stayed quiet. Thought my silence meant I was scared, or defeated, or willing to just take whatever they threw at me. They were about to learn a very expensive lesson about the difference between quiet and powerless. 2 weeks after the move out, I lost my biggest client. A contract worth roughly 40% of my annual revenue. They didn't even bother to construct a convincing lie, just a corporate boilerplate email about restructuring priorities and strategic realignment. I knew it was Richard. Knew he'd made a phone call, or set up a lunch meeting, or pulled whatever strings powerful, connected men pull when they want to hurt someone without getting their hands visibly dirty. I spent 3 days barely sleeping, stress-eating cold pizza at 2 a.m, genuinely wondering if my company was going to survive this coordinated assault. But somewhere around day 4, sitting alone in my office at 3 a.m., staring at financial projections and cash flow spreadsheets, I realized panic wasn't going to save my business. Emotion wasn't going to solve anything. If I was going to fight back, it had to be smart, calculated, and completely untraceable directly to me. I started researching Richard the same way I'd research any complex business problem. Diving into public records, court filings, business registrations, news archives, property records, everything that was legally available to anyone who knew where to look and had the patience to dig. It took me about a week of late nights, cross-referencing documents and building timelines. And what I found was a pattern that honestly shocked me, even though it probably shouldn't have, given what I'd already seen of his character. Richard had been sued 6 times over the past 8 years by small contractors, electricians, plumbers, HVAC companies, construction outfits. All claiming essentially the same story with minor variations. He'd hire them for work on his commercial properties. They'd complete the job according to specifications, submit their invoices, and then Richard would start finding phantom problems with the work. Claim it wasn't up to standard, threatened to sue them for breach of contract, and eventually force them to accept settlement payments for 60 or 70 cents on the dollar just to get something. These weren't big, established companies with legal departments and cash reserves for long court battles. These were family operations, father-son businesses, guys with 2 or 3 employees who needed that payment to make payroll and keep their trucks running. And Richard had systematically squeezed every single one of them because he had the resources to wait them out, and they didn't. The court records were all public information, case numbers right there in the database. I sat back in my office chair, reading through the 6th lawsuit, thinking about poetic justice and karma, and how sometimes the universe gives you exactly the tool you need. I didn't want to be the one to expose him. Didn't want this traced back to me in any possible way. So, I started thinking strategically about who would benefit most from this information becoming widely known. That's when I remembered Spark Electrical. They were one of the contractors who'd sued Richard 3 years ago. Small family business, father and 2 sons, according to the case file, and they'd been forced to settle for about $12,000 less than they were contractually owed. I found their business email listed on their website, created a completely anonymous Proton Mail account using a VPN and burner details, and spent 2 careful hours crafting a message that was factual, neutral, and genuinely helpful, without revealing anything about my personal connection. I didn't mention Chloe, didn't mention the wedding, didn't add any editorial commentary or emotional language. I just methodically laid out the pattern I'd discovered, provided case numbers and filing dates for all 6 lawsuits, and ended with a simple question about how many other small contractors had probably been pressured into silence because they couldn't afford to fight. I included a list of business journalists who covered construction industry issues and commercial real estate in our region, suggested this might be a story worth investigating from a business ethics angle, and hit send at 4:15 on a Tuesday morning. For 2 full weeks, absolutely nothing happened. I started wondering if my email had just disappeared into a spam folder or been dismissed as some crank with an axe to grind. But then Sam forwarded me a link to a local business news site with a headline about predatory payment practices in the commercial construction sector. The article was thorough, professionally reported, and absolutely devastating to anyone who cared about their reputation. The journalist had tracked down and interviewed 4 of the 6 contractors who'd sued Richard, found 3 additional contractors who'd been squeezed the same way but hadn't filed lawsuits because they couldn't afford legal fees, and laid out the entire pattern with specific dates, dollar amounts, and direct quotes from the victims. Richard's name appeared 17 times in the article. His company's practices were explicitly described as exploitative and predatory. The reporter had even gotten a quote from a business ethics professor at the state university about how this kind of behavior damages entire industries and destroys trust in legitimate business relationships. I read the article 3 complete times, carefully checking that there was absolutely nothing in it that could be traced back to me or my anonymous email. And then I just leaned back in my chair and watched what happened next. The story got picked up by 2 other regional outlets within 48 hours. One of them, a fairly prominent business paper with circulation across 3 states. Suddenly, Richard's tactics were being discussed in contractor forums, construction industry Facebook groups, and local business association meetings. The charitable board he'd sat on for 6 years quietly announced his resignation 2 weeks later, buried the news in a routine newsletter update, but people in those circles noticed and started asking questions. One of his major real estate investors backed out of a mixed-use development project worth several million, citing concerns about reputational risk and due diligence issues. I only knew about it because the Business Journal ran a brief follow-up article mentioning the withdrawal. Richard wasn't destroyed. His business didn't collapse overnight. He wasn't criminally charged with anything, but his influence took a serious, measurable hit. His reputation had a permanent, visible stain that wouldn't wash out. And most importantly, he couldn't bully small contractors as easily anymore because everyone in the industry was watching and documenting. Chloe's social media presence gradually shifted over the following months from wedding planning content and couple photos to vague philosophical posts about betrayal and learning to trust yourself after trauma. I watched from a distance as her follower count steadily dropped because people were getting tired of the victim narrative. She'd built her entire public identity around being half of the perfect engaged couple, cultivated this whole Instagram aesthetic based on our relationship. Now she was scrambling to rebrand herself as some kind of survivor and inspirational figure, and it just wasn't landing with her audience. I heard through mutual friends that she'd started dating someone new about 3 months after everything ended, some guy who worked in middle management at her father's company. I felt absolutely nothing about it. No jealousy, no vindication, no anger. Just this mild, detached curiosity about whether she'd try the same entitled approach with him, or if she'd learned anything. My business stabilized after about 4 months of careful navigation and damage control. I landed 2 significant new clients who actually appreciated my professionalism and reliability, brought on 3 new employees, and the chronic stress headaches that had become constant during the wedding planning phase just disappeared completely. I moved to a better apartment with actual building security and a doorman. Got a place with more natural light and a proper home office setup. And I put my grandfather's watch on the nightstand next to my bed where I could see it every morning when I woke up. Sometimes, late at night when I couldn't sleep, I'd think back to that moment when Chloe gave me the ultimatum. How she'd been so absolutely confident that I'd choose her over protecting what I'd built. And I'd wonder if she ever understood that it wasn't really about the prenup at all. It was about what the prenup revealed about how she viewed my work, my sacrifice, my years of effort. She'd shown me exactly how she saw my company and my success. And once I saw that clearly, there was no possible way to unsee it, or go back. Richard never contacted me again after that morning in the hotel lobby. And I genuinely don't know if he ever figured out that I had anything to do with the article that damaged his reputation. But part of me hopes he spent at least some time wondering, questioning, maybe suspecting that the quiet guy who wouldn't fight back in person had actually been planning something far more effective than a confrontation. I look at my grandfather's watch sometimes, watch the second hand move in perfectly steady increments around the face. And I think about how the best, most important decisions in life are usually the ones you make when you're calm. When you're thinking clearly, when you're not being manipulated by emotion or pressure or someone else's expectations about who you should be. Ending that engagement was the best business decision I ever made. And I don't mean that cynically or coldly. I mean it literally and precisely because it taught me that sometimes protecting what you've built means walking away from what you thought you wanted. And there's a very specific kind of freedom that comes from choosing your actual future over someone else's fantasy about who you should be. What do you think about this story?